It's week 2 of Bible Studies for Life. We're continuing in the book of John, chapter 13, and here looking at Jesus' interactions with his disciples, a real challenge that happens here for them, and how they are going to respond to it is really important. Before we dive into the passage, be sure and like, subscribe, comment on it, share it with others. We appreciate that. All right. When Jesus had said this, he was troubled in his spirit, and he testified, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." Oh, this had to be a tough thing for Jesus to share with them, right? One of you is going to betray me. He knew. He knew who it was. He knew what was going to happen. But still difficult and a hard thing for the disciples. We see that the disciples started looking at one another, uncertain which one he was speaking about. You can imagine what happens when here's this table and there are 13 men seated around this table, and Jesus looks at them and he says, "One of you in this room right now is going to betray me." How challenging that must have been. They start looking at each other. Makes sense, right? I mean, and they start wondering. They start questioning which one of them. And they have reasons that they believe all of them will. And I think, personally, I think even Judas was wondering, I wonder which one's going to do it. Because he didn't see what he was doing as betraying Jesus, I don't think. But anyway, here we go. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, so that's going to be John, who wrote this account, right? So he has a first-hand account of this, was reclining close beside Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to him to find out who it was he was talking about. So Peter gets John's attention. Maybe they're sitting next to each other. We don't know, but he says, "You need to find out who he's talking about." It appears that he wasn't sitting next to him because he says he motioned to him. So he wants John to ask, right? So he leaned back against Jesus and he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" You know, they all wanted to ask the question, right? I mean, every one of them wanted to ask this question. But John does. He says, "Who is it? Who's it going to be?" You might, if you'd never read it, was Jesus going to tell him or not? Jesus replied, "He's the one I give the piece of bread to after I have dipped it." And when he had dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, Judas Iscariot. After Judas ate the piece of bread, Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, "What you're doing, do quickly." Okay. So he tells him it's the one that I dip the bread with and that eats the bread that I dip, right? So whoever I dipped, that is, and he gives it to Simon Iscariot, Judas Iscariot, and Judas eats the bread. Here's the passage, the part of this, the phrase that I think should grab our attention. Satan entered him. Now, what does that mean? Right? Satan entered him. Was it that he was doing the bidding of Satan before, but now Satan has possessed Judas, has overwhelmed his spirit? Satan has now taken control of him. Is it John's way of expressing that he gave in to the worst of himself? He gave. I think you have to take it for what it means. You have to take it clearly, right, and plainly. Satan entered him, as John writes, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, so that John may not have known this or realized this or seen this, but as he wrote it, looking back, he sees that at that moment, something about Judas changed. There was a difference, which is why I think Jesus tells him, you need to go ahead and what you're going to do, you need to do it now. You don't need to be here. You can't be here. If you're going to be possessed or overwhelmed or subservient to Satan himself, you cannot be with us. You're going to have to leave. So he gets up and he leaves under the leadership of Satan now, under the lordship, you might say, of Satan instead of Christ. When he had left, and it says in there in the part we're skipping over here that he left, and the disciples all thought, well, he must be going to take care of something. Jesus told him to take care of it because he was the treasurer. He had the money. He needed to go pay for the room. I don't know. Pay the bill. Jesus said, "Now the Son of God, the Son of Man, is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Children, I am with you a little while longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so now I tell you, where I am going, you cannot come. Okay, this phrase we're really going to get to next week. Okay, it comes up more next week, but right now I really want to look at this verse 31. The Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. And if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Okay, I want you to see a couple of things that I think are important to us to know. One of those is this symbiotic relationship that Jesus is describing between God the Father and the Son of Man, Jesus himself. And you see this glorification that happens, and that he's glorified, that Jesus is glorified, and God the Father is glorified, and if one's glorified, the other's glorified, and it goes back and forth. This is because Jesus and God the Father are one God with the Holy Spirit, the three persons of the Trinity. And so clearly when Jesus gets glorified, this is glorifying also to God the Father. Okay, but I wanted to point out something else here. Now, this word now, and at once. In this moment, when Judas leaves, he is putting into motion the crucifixion, right? It's all going to happen. And he says, now, Son of Man is glorified. That in the tragedy that is about to occur, and I think, from a human standpoint, we see that as the great tragedy of the crucifixion. The greatest man who ever lived, who had no sin, is given the worst death that can ever happen. He is betrayed by one of his own. He's killed by his own religious leaders. Right? He is alone. He is naked. All the horrible things that are going to occur at the crucifixion, and Jesus says, "Now I am glorified. That I am gaining great glory. That God the Father will gain great glory through this. That as He will be made known." And He's right, isn't He? It's at the cross that Jesus has the most fame, the most glory, that He is most known for. The cross is the symbol of the church. Everybody knows that, right? This is so clear. And in the midst of tragedy, God is gaining glory for Jesus and for Himself. In what from Satan's side of it and from man's side of it, as we look at it just in the moment, we see loss. We see disgust. We see cursing. Right? You die on a tree, you're cursed. This is the worst that can happen. And at the worst moment, God is gaining glory. I tell you that God redeems everything, okay? Everything He redeems. He brings Himself glory no matter what happens. He brings Himself glory. And then He says, where I'm going, you cannot come. We'll come back to that later. I give you a new command, love one another just as I have loved you, and you are also to love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. It's interesting, isn't it, that after talking about, being glorified and then here being betrayed, and what's about to happen, being betrayed, is going to lead to death, that Jesus' next phrase here is about love. Here, I'm giving you a command. You need to love one another. And I think maybe it's because in the midst of great tragedy and loss and grief and hurt and pain and injustice, Jesus' call is to love people. Love one another. As I have loved you, you're to love one another. We think about all the ways that Jesus loved His disciples. The myriad of ways. He's just washed their feet, right, to show them subservience and all the ways that He loved them. And then He says, you do that. What I've done, you do for one another. And then by this, here's the great testimony of love no matter what. Love no matter who. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Because it is so clear that Jesus loved, and if you love, then you're being like Jesus. Everybody will know. And this, this love that we have for others that's patient and kind and this love that we have that forgives, is gracious and generous. This gives testimony to Christ. This is the testimony that the church needs to be leaving the world. Love one another. Well, I hope that helps as you go through your study. I had a couple of questions there that I thought might help as you do your discussions in your classroom. God bless you. Thank you so much for teaching. I really appreciate you watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel, like the videos, comment on them, share them with others so that they can have them for their classes as well. We thank you so much. We'll see you next time.